I want to take a page out of Blake's book. Now, that doesn't mean that tonight I'm going to cover all the aspects of the eye, or the foot, or the arm, or the leg, or whatever. After all, that is his task for the next time. Remember, we said next time he does eyes. If you weren't here last week, he did a marvelous presentation about, what body part was it? The hand. You know, and the reason that's a segue, it's actually a segue from two different directions over the past couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago on Sunday morning, we had More Nation service where we encouraged not only our new deacons, but also the church, once again, to take seriously its responsibility to disciple. But the texts that we used, and I'm going to refer to some of them tonight, were not just about discipling. They're the next step beyond discipling. I just put my hymnal away, but I need it. What's the next step beyond discipling? Jesus had how many disciples? Well, this is not a trick question, okay? He had 12. One of them did not live up to expectations. How many were there then after Pentecost? There were 12 again, because they chose whom? Matthias. But Jesus went beyond discipleship. Jesus went beyond discipleship and went to mentorship. How many did he mentor? Well, he sent out 70. That's more. What? 3, maybe 4. We find him in the garden with those 3. We find him on the Mount of Transfiguration with those 3. When he then tells them about the end times in Mark 13 and parallel passages, there were 4. Also, Andrew was there. So he mentored, he poured himself specially into some. For what reason? Think back in your lives about mentoring. Yeah, you've been discipled and you've discipled others, but was there somebody that took a special interest in you and bringing out from you God's leadership qualities and help you identify how you could be a Christian leader? That's mentorship. 456. 456. That's hymn 456. Not in your Bible, not page 456 in the Bible, okay. Hymn 456. I couldn't find this anywhere in the Bible, and it took, in the hymnal, Beverly had to find it for me, because in my mind I was saying, take my hand, precious Lord. I was looking under the T's. The problem with that is if it's take my hand, precious Lord, the second line doesn't rhyme. It's the other way around. It's what? Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, and help me stand. Stand rhymes with hand, not with Lord. Okay. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn through the storm, through the night. Lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord. Take me home. And what does that have to do with things? The image that Blake drew for us, he has an uncanny ability to see things in everyday life and to turn them into very practical teaching points, doesn't he? And some of you have that gift too, and I really appreciate it. When he told the story about watching the lady walk across the parking lot at the grocery store after he set it up, it's crowded, busy, traffic, she's got 3 kids, baby in hand, with one little boy, and then she told the little boy, take your sister's hand. And he was talking about the way the Lord leads us. And I talked to him about this afterward, and he just didn't want to go down this road because his main focus was on the hand of the Lord. He saw it too. What did you see in that? What about the little boy? What did the little boy do? He took his little sister's hand and he held on tight. We see that's mentoring. The Lord takes our hand to do what? To take somebody else's hand. How many of y'all are older brother or sister? You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Mom and Daddy told you, watch Billy or watch Sue or whatever, and when that command came, you had an awesome and terrible responsibility, didn't you? I'm 12 years older than my brother. He is now what am I? He's now 61. Yeah. Wow, it's hard to imagine. I don't remind him today that I changed his diapers. You don't do that with the deputy sheriff in Mobile County, you know. But you know what I'm talking about. I want to talk about mentoring tonight and biblical, what it means to be a biblical mentor. The most obvious example of this, I think, is Moses and Joshua. And what do we see in the lives of Moses and Joshua? And by the way, the application of this is, folks, God probably calls you at some time in your life to be not only a discipler and to make a disciple, but somebody that God's called into your life, especially to develop as a what? As a Christian leader. Well, the divine call to mentorship with Moses comes in Deuteronomy 1, right at the beginning of that book. And the Lord was angry with me also on your account, he tells Israel. And he said to me, not even you shall enter there. And we know why. He got angry, was disobedient to God. He struck the rock. He didn't speak to it. But it was more about his attitude. We know that. And then he says, Joshua, the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter there. And then he says this, encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit that land. Wow. What a tremendous opportunity, but also obligation. What was he saying? You are going to be Joshua's mentor, but there had been plenty of divine preparation up to that point. You see, God had already been preparing that crossing of those, the blessing of the two paths that had already crossed. God had already been working in the life of Joshua before this point, before they're getting ready to go into the promised land. Joshua had been military commander. Moses had designated him to be the man on the ground as they fought the Amalekites. You remember that story from Exodus. So he'd been trained in military prowess. After the battle, then God commanded Moses, and he said, I want you to make a memorial of this battle, and then what I want you to do is not recite it to Israel. I want you to recite it to whom? To Joshua. Because it was going to be Joshua that was going to remind them of the victory over the Amalekites as he led them into the promised land. You see, Joshua was Moses' aide-de-camp. Moses was the 4-star general or 5-star general, and Joshua was his major or lieutenant colonel aide-de-camp. And he attended him everywhere he went. He went up Mount Horeb a certain distance with Moses when the rest didn't. He stayed in the tent of meeting day in and day out with Moses, and that's where Moses talked with God. Now, I'm not suggesting that that means that Joshua heard it all, but he was there. You see, God was preparing Joshua even before he commands him to be encouraged by Moses in Deuteronomy 1. And Moses warned him about something in Numbers, the 11th chapter. He said, you know, this isn't about me. You're being trained not to follow me as a hero. I'm not your hero. God is your hero. You know, that instance was when Moses was threatened by the people of Israel, and Joshua tried to intervene. And he said, look, it's not about me. God will protect me. I'm not your hero. Joshua was a spy. He was an intelligence officer, not just aide-de-camp. We know he and who else were the ones that came back with the good reports from the promise? Caleb. See, God had been preparing Joshua. I may have said Moses a minute ago. I meant to say Joshua. God had been preparing Joshua then all this time before he tells Moses to mentor him. And then there comes the transfer of authority in Numbers, the 27th chapter. So the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him and have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And then what I want you to do is commission him in their sight, and you shall put on him some of your authority in order that all the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. See, God had planned all along the transfer of authority, but he knew that it was important that somebody do what? Train Joshua in how to lead, and that's mentorship. What are some of the principles that we see in this story? Well, there was a divine call to mentor and to be a protege. We've seen that. There was the followers' complete devotion. Joshua was completely devoted to his friend, leader, and companion Moses, and he submitted to his supervision. And it wasn't easy. You know, in this mentoring relationship, It's not always easy. Sometimes what we have to do is we have to step back and we have to let go a little bit and let people do what? Learn from the tough and hard challenges of leadership. And that's what he did with Joshua. You know, there's practical, challenging, hard work in learning how to become a leader. There's risk involved in that. There's risk in failure. You know, this is one of the problems that we've had for a couple of generations in America. Parents who are so protective, who want their kids always to be safe in every instance, that they're always intervening for their safety to create a shell around them and protect them. That is not good mentorship. Now, I'm not saying that we put them in harm's way, needlessly, but there comes a time with our children, there come times if you're a mentor with somebody, that you need to let them step out and risk a little bit of danger, maybe even risk failure, maybe even risk in not being number one amongst their classmates. Wow. And to trust God for your confidence, not popularity. To trust God for your protection and not your mentor. To trust God and not your parents. In Deuteronomy 3, it says this, your eyes have seen all that the Lord your God has done to these two kings that we have defeated, Sihon and Og, so that the Lord shall do to all the kingdoms into which you are about to cross. He's saying this to Israel, but he's saying it to Joshua. Do not fear them, for the Lord your God is the one fighting for you. We need to remind our kids, we need to remind those that we're mentoring that we're going to pass off the scene someday. We're not going to be there to protect them. And it's going to be who? It's going to be God in whom they place their confidence. And that's the way Moses mentored Joshua. Mentors encourage and strengthen their followers. We see this in this story. And eventually, mentors let go. They let go and they let their proteges then test their own wings. This came at whose initiative? Two people's initiative. I know that when you're young, you ought to seek a mentor, but in that relationship, probably the initiative ought to come from the mentor. A mentor ought to be able to see people who have a special promise and that God has placed upon them the responsibility to call them aside. And if God's calling you to be a mentor of somebody, we need to have ears tuned to that. And then call that person alongside and, not force yourself on the person, but say, I'm here. I want to encourage you. But the real initiative comes from God. He places that on our heart. And if he's working on the heart of the mentor, then he's working on the heart of the Joshua as well. And it's a very natural sort of thing. Mentorship programs in corporations today, most of them fail. You know why? Because we're going to pair up, and they assign mentors and proteges. And folks, that rarely works to its fullest potential. Because mentorship, and what do you call the other side of it? Menteeship? I don't know. Protégeship, follower, maybe that's a good term. Followership, mentorship and followership is a thing that ought to emerge out of the interaction of personalities. That's divinely ordained, I believe. But it's a relational thing. It's not an organizational thing. You see, proteges then also stand on the shoulders of their mentors. Did Joshua stand on Moses' shoulders? Yeah, he did. You see, his military successes far exceeded those of the defeat of Sihon and Og and the Amalekites when they went into the promised land, victory after victory after victory. And oh, by the way, Joshua entered the promised land and Moses didn't. What kind of leadership is this? Well, we know what it is. It's servant leadership. And that is a threadbare term today in popular society. But the word there sharath means aid. And that's what Joshua was. He was Moses' aide, his aide de camp, one who attends upon, waits upon, assists. But when you look at Joshua, the 5th chapter, you have to put it into context. Joshua really wasn't Moses' bondservant. It wasn't that kind of relationship. He wasn't Moses' slave. Y'all are doing a study, some of you in Sunday school, about basically the scarlet thread of redemption on Sunday morning, aren't you? Have you come to the story about Joshua standing outside Jericho? Is that this next week? Well, it's about to come. I don't want to steal any thunder, but Joshua's standing outside the Jericho, and he's looking at it. And the commander of the host of the Lord comes to him. Wow. And he makes it very clear to Joshua that you are the Lord's bondservant. And then he says to him what? Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. Now, who does that sound like? Moses. And who said that to Moses? The Lord said it to Moses. So Joshua, if he didn't understand it now, understands very clearly that he's not Moses' bondservant, he's the Lord's bondservant. But what he did was he brought him under the mentorship of Moses to learn how to lead. You see, that's the way servant leadership is. Servant leadership is bond service to the Lord God Almighty. And then what he does is he brings us into the presence of mentors who teach us how to lead. And we serve them in that respect. A couple of other examples. Elisha and Elijah, or is it the other way around? Who came first? Elijah. 1 Kings 19. Elisha, and he points him out to Elijah. You shall appoint him as a prophet in your place. There's a very clear transition of leadership that's about to occur. And we find the same kind of relationship. Elisha was just as devoted to Elijah as Joshua was to Moses. And what did he do? He was wholeheartedly devoted. He went and he sacrificed his oxen. He took the wooden yoke and all the instruments that went along with the farming, and he cast them into the fire. He was wholeheartedly devoted to following Elijah without looking back. Jesus said, once you put your hand to the plow and you follow me, you are not worthy to be my disciple if you're going to do it with what? With one head cocked over your shoulder looking behind you. Elijah was wholeheartedly committed. And Elijah let Elisha be tested by risk. As far as we know, apparently Elisha was with Elijah when they fought the two wars against the Arameans. He was right in the thick of it. And in Elijah's final confrontations with Ahab, Jezebel, and Ahaziah, the next king, Elisha's probably standing right there watching his mentor deal with that risk and doing a risk assessment. And Elijah encouraged Elisha. He said, what do you want from me? And Elisha answered and said, what? Give me a double portion of your spirit. And he said, that's not for me to give. But you see, he encouraged him. He asked him the question. It was God's initiative that brought them together, and it was God's initiative that would answer that question. And he did. And Elisha stood on Elijah's shoulders, because when that mantle dropped, he got a what? A double measure of the Spirit. And Elisha was a servant leader just like Joshua was. For the same term that was used of Joshua earlier, Sharath, is used in 1 Kings, the 19th chapter of Elisha. Last example from the Old Testament, look at the kings. Was David a good mentor? Yes, he was. David spent a lot of time with Solomon, and all of 2 Chronicles 22 through 29 is talking about David's preparing Solomon for kingship. He developed the resources and the plan for building the temple so that Solomon could do it, and he showed him how to do it. He elevated him to king along with him and trained him before David ever died. He supervised Solomon's revision of the administration of the army and showed him how to do it. And he took Solomon in front of the people, and he publicly affirmed Solomon as a successor, and he secured the allegiance of the people for Solomon. You see, that's good mentorship. Now, let's ask this question. What kind of mentor was Solomon? Pretty poor, wasn't he? Yeah. I mean, after all, his son Rehoboam immediately did what? He did like his father. He followed the idols of his wives. That is, Solomon did, and he did the same thing. Isn't that interesting? The author of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, if he's Kohelet, which we believe he was, and Song of Solomon, turned out to be a bad example. Was he a mentor? Yes, he was a mentor. What kind of mentor? A bad mentor. You see, the later kings, then, all the later kings of Israel, then, after Jeroboam, okay, wasn't his son, were they mentors? Talking about the northern kingdom. Jeroboam and the 17 kings that followed, were they mentors? Yes, they were mentors. What kind of mentors were they? Thoroughly rotten and bad. Every one of them. They did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they taught their children how to do so. That kingdom lasted 209 years. You look at Judah, and it was a bit different. They were all mentors to some degree. 12 of them were bad for 117 years total time. But the good mentors ruled twice as long. The 7 rulers that were good ruled for a total of 227 years, an average of 26 years per reign. God honored their good leadership and their good mentorship. Asa was a good mentor of Jehoshaphat, but it broke down afterward with Jehoram. One after the other, Joash and Amaziah and Uzziah were good mentors of their sons, and Jotham as well. But then Jotham's son, Ahaz, turned out to be a rotten apple. Was Hezekiah a good mentor? Well, maybe he tried, but the most evil of the Judean kings was his son. I don't know how well he mentored. Josiah, a great reformer, but I don't know how well he mentored because Jehoahaz started a chain that then led to the final destruction of the southern kingdom. Let me take a look for a couple of minutes at New Testament examples. The most obvious one, I think, would be Paul, after Jesus. We've already talked about Jesus, okay? The 3 principles of leadership that you see in Paul, and we talked about those a couple of weeks ago. He said what? Follow my example, then put it into practice, and then pass it on. That's pretty good advice from a mentor to a protege. Follow my example. It's not my self-confidence, but you do what I do if I'm following the Lord. And we covered those passages 2 Sundays ago. To the Corinthians, he said, therefore I urge you to imitate me. To the Philippians, he says, brothers, join together in following my example. To the Thessalonians, he said, for you yourselves know the good example that I set for you. Good mentors aren't perfect, but if they're following Christ, they set an example that is worthy of following. Follow me, the old infantry slogan. Used to be out in front of Fort Benning, but they're changing the name of Fort Benning. I can't remember what it's going to be now, Lendell. But that image of that infantry soldier going into battle with the arm extended saying, follow me, that's a picture of a good mentor. Put it into practice. To the Philippians, he said, whatever you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, put it into practice and pass it on. Then he says to Timothy, and these things which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, and what I want you to do is I want you to entrust it to what? To reliable persons, to reliable people then, who will also be qualified to teach others. So these principles of mentorship that we see in Paul, follow me, put it into practice, pass it on, and he did this. Now, I said I wasn't going to take the time on Sunday morning to mention them all, but he mentored at least 20, and tonight I'm going to take about 30 seconds to mention them. Think of these names: Timothy, John Mark, Luke, Silas, Erastus, Aristarchus, Gaius, Trophimus, Tychicus, Epaphras, Sopater, Sosipater, Onesimus, Sosthenes, Lydia, probably, Priscilla and Aquila, almost certainly, Damaris, Dionysius, and Philemon. The New Testament is filled with people that Paul mentored. How? Personally, investing themselves personally, and then doing what? Something that we don't do anymore. When was the last time you got a handwritten letter? He handwrote some of those letters, and he used Timothy or a secretary to write some of them. And one of them he says, yeah, I'm showing you that I'm the one that was the author of this, and he wrote his name in big script. Not only personal relationship, but he wrote. That's a good thing for us to do, is to drop a note to a person and encourage them from time to time in person, in a close personal relationship. He called Timothy and Titus his sons in the faith, and he treated others as fellow workers, collaborators. And he gave them responsibilities. He didn't hold on to them. He sent Timothy to Corinth and also to Ephesus. He sent Titus to Crete. And Timothy, he even gave the privilege of being, I don't know if he's co-author, but co-sender of 6 of the letters of the New Testament. You see, Paul set an example of mentorship. And with the Corinthians, if you look at 1 Corinthians, it's really a letter of what? It's really a letter of discipline. But if you look at 2 Corinthians, it's really a mentoring letter. There were other mentoring letters that he wrote to the Ephesians, to Philippians, and the Colossians. And in those he instructed, but he also confronted about the things that were wrong, and he encouraged them to change and to be faithful. Last example. probably the consummate mentor after Jesus in the New Testament, even before Paul, I would say. If I were to ask you to guess, you'd probably guess his name. He was the son of encouragement. Who was he? Barnabas. He encouraged the church in Jerusalem with his gift and set an example for them to follow in Acts, the 4th chapter. He was one of the 70 elders of the early church. The Bible doesn't tell us that, but Clement of Alexandria does. He was an apostle full of the Holy Spirit, Acts, the 11th chapter says. And he was sent by Jerusalem and then back to Antioch to do what? To build up the work there. You see, it's not just about mentoring people, it's also about mentoring churches. So who is Barnabas' most famous follower? When I say follower, they worked as co-laborers, but who was it that brought him to Antioch and gave him a chance when nobody else would? It was Saul that Barnabas mentored. He interceded on his behalf with the apostles and stood for him when they were opposed to him. He recognized Saul's gifts when no one else would, before he was Paul. He confirmed Saul's mission to the Gentiles before he was ever Paul. And he stood by Paul's side. Paul followed his example. Just like Barnabas, he worked for a living. Just like Barnabas, he helped make a collection for the poor churches. And Barnabas treated Paul as a colleague on his first missionary journey. And what did Paul do? He stood on the shoulders of his mentor, and he far surpassed anything that we know for sure that Barnabas did, although he continued in the ministry. He not only mentored Paul, but he mentored John Mark. His cousin, we know that when he and Paul fell out over Paul, he recovered him and he mentored him. And did he succeed in recovering his cousin, John Mark? Yes, he did. He did a good job of mentoring. You see, later we find Paul affirming John Mark in his ministry in 2 Timothy 4. He is worth something. He is worth using again. John Mark ministered to Paul later when he was in prison, and almost certainly he was with Peter when Peter was in Rome, because whose account of the gospel do we find in Mark's gospel? Peter's account. So if you stop and think about that, about this business of mentoring, Jesus mentored directly Peter, James, and John, and I believe he mentored Paul too, through the Spirit. So you've got Peter and Paul who mentor Mark, and we've got the primary synoptic gospel upon whose account a lot of Matthew and Luke was based. And then you got John, and then you have all the Pauline epistles. And the only one and then you've got, of course, Peter's epistles. We've got John's epistles. We've got Revelation. About the only books in the New Testament that I cannot show either directly or indirectly related to Jesus' mentorship is whoever wrote Hebrews. And I personally don't think it was Paul, okay? And which other book? James. But James was who? He was Jesus' brother. Don't tell me that Jesus didn't mentor him. The New Testament is largely a product of Jesus mentoring those that would lead the church. And you see, Barnabas was a value-added mentor. He had a special ability to see something in people, like Saul, who was not yet Paul, and like John Mark, that seemed to have forfeited his ministry, and to recover them and rebuild them when others had no faith in them. So let me ask you, as you think about God's role in your life, if he's calling you to be a mentor of somebody, and he may. It may be somebody that isn't so obvious. It may be somebody that other folks have discounted. It may be somebody that hasn't shown a great deal of promise, but God shows you that there's promise in this person's life, and he may call you to recover that person, to rebuild that person, to encourage that person when nobody else will.